Chapter 1 of The Revolt of the Birds by Melville Davisson Post. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Read by Ben Tucker. The Revolt of the Birds by Melville Davisson Post. Chapter 1. It was the last outpost of down-going men, a sort of seamen's club in the abominable environs of Hong Kong. The Wu Fang Company maintained it for the white officers employed in its service. Everybody knows the reputation of the Wu Fang Company. It is the most notorious of all the Oriental companies trading in the China Sea. Gun-running, opium, even piracy are charged against it when its ships are out of the beaten track. It was a room under a warehouse, looking out on a sort of canal in which the waters seemed to lie stagnant and unmoving. There were tables in it, and a dirty matting on the floor. Against the wall were a few shelves made from packing cases. In them were some stained dog-eared works on navigation. There was dirty canvas on the wall. There was the stench of alcohol in it, and tobacco. A single window fouled with cobweb, looking out on the canal, alone lighted it. One marked a smoky lamp against the wall, a cheap kerosene lamp that the Germans used to put out in the East. It was afternoon and hot. A few men were in the room. They were strange human derelicts on the way down, but maintaining a sort of air, a sort of manner, as though it were a memory from the honorable life from which they had descended. A queer group gathered from all portions of the earth. They were all at the very end of life. I mean at the end of any form of life that one could speak of. This club of the Wu Fang Company was the last stand of their fleet in the world. One stepped off from it into the abyss of the Far East. A little wizened Chinaman, gliding about in slippered feet, carried in the drink and the tobacco that the Wu Fang Company provided. The drink was a poisonous brandy. I had drifted in here on my mission. Someone had told me to see Bennett of the Wu Fang Company. He would have the last knowledge of men disappearing into the mystery of the East, the last glimpse of them as they descended through its fluid floor. He now sat beyond me at a table by the window. He was a big man with pale blue eyes, a heavy, pasty face pitted with smallpox, a strange human creature. It was impossible to tell the nationality of the man. I think he was an American, and I think he must have been bred and trained for the sea. He might have been in the naval service of the States in his far-off youth. I knew what was commonly known about the man before I went to find him. He had been in every form of service and on every sea. He knew all about the world of waters, and he had gone steadily down. One heard little about the causes of this descent. There was always a break in the narrative when one gets the history of the derelict of the East, a sort of hiatus where the speaker pauses, gets another cigarette out of the box on the table, or makes some vague gesture. One is supposed to understand that at this point in the man's life, something happened, and he took yet another step downward. Thus in the end they come into the service of the Wu Fang Company, and, from it, the abyss engulfs them. There were 3 other men in the room besides Bennett. I tried to place them in their nationality. One was a German, a northern German. He was not past 40, a big blonde. Bennett called him the Baron Nordheim. Another I thought was an Italian, a little dark man, thin and very carefully dressed. And there was an Englishman with the strong, clean-cut features of some of the best families of his race. Tall, stooped. He sat in his chair as though all energy in him had been removed. The man drew my attention for the one fact that the conspicuous element in him was an utter weakness. There was no firm fiber left. There was no resistance to evil in that face or figure. He maintained the manner, the speech, and the customs of his race, but it was easy to see that he was seized upon and dominated by any temptation that approached him. I hardly understood how he could be of any service even to the Wu Fang Company, but, as I have said, its activities were varied. They all wore a sort of uniform. Bennett had the uniform of an English skipper, threadbare and stained, picked up doubtless at some seaman's sail by the Wu Fang Company. There was good cloth and gold braid on these other ship captains' uniforms, but it was cloth long wetted with sea-water and dried in the sun, and it was tarnished gold braid. The Englishman had an ancient copy of the Times. He was nearsighted, and he held it close to his face. It was torn. The Chinese servant had probably fished it out of a rubbish heap somewhere in the European quarter. The Wufeng Company did not keep up the periodicals of the world for its sea captains. It provided, as I've said, only the essentials: uniforms of the service, drink, tobacco, and what was more important than any, I imagine, opium. The Italian had been reading a thumb-worn little book. When I came in, he put it down on the floor beside the chair, his big finger marking a page in it. He sat perfectly still, his other hand on his knee, his eyes fixed on the floor beyond him. He paid no attention to either Bennett or myself. He did not seem to see us, to see anything. I'm trying to make you realize this place and the men I found in it. It did not seem to belong in the world. The men in the place seemed to belong in some form of nightmare, some vague conception of a hell where men maintained the forms and manners of the world from which they had descended. But it was all a sort of abominable pretense. They spoke with exaggerated courtesy. They were careful to accord each his title and distinction. They listened attentively when one spoke, and they made some remark at the end of it, or some courteous interjection. But one felt, as I have said, that it was all a ghastly pretense. I had directed the conversation. I had an object in it. It began when I entered precisely after the manner of conversation in any officers' club in the East. I had a letter of introduction to Bennett. It had been given to me with a significant smile. If I wish to get anything out of these men, I must respect their fictions. I must maintain the formalities customary among officers of the class to which they pretended. One can understand why these derelicts were sticklers for form. It was the only thing they had. It maintained the pretension in which they alone existed. I had gotten the conversation directed toward strange happenings on the sea, toward mysterious incidents which had happened in their lives. I thought these incidents might give me some information on the thing I was after. But before the conversation reached the point, I was impressed with how nearly it resembled the conversation in the real officers' club in Hong Kong. And, what was other resemblance to the real club, these men were authorities on some form of life in which they were engaged. But it was not this counterfeit conversation of the real club that I was after. I moved it into another direction. I moved it into the direction of the experiences I spoke of. Bennett helped me. I do not know that he realized precisely what I was seeking, but here was a field in which he could be very proud of his associates, in which they would excel. Surely of all persons in the world, they had had the largest experience of extraordinary events. They gave me these events as one recites the incidents of an historical narrative. It is not my intention here to elaborate what they said. Their strange tales have little to do directly with this story, except, as it happened, they each illustrated a vital point in it. I listened, made the reply courteous, and thanked them for their consideration of me. I bought them tobacco and brandy, and bid them adieu when they went out, for they presently drifted out, leaving Bennett and myself alone by the table near the cobwebbed window that looked out on the sluggish canal. I was not impressed with the stories of the strange events that these men related. I said that much to Bennett. I said they impressed me as fiction. He was silent for some time. He moved his big hand over his face. Finally, he replied. "They might be true," he said. "Incredible things happen." He directed my attention to the little worn book lying by the chair in which the Italian had been seated. "There is nothing too incredible to be attached to these men," he said. "You wouldn't believe the things in which these men are interested. Let me get you that book." He got up heavily, crossed the room, picked up the book, and put it down open before me. It was a translation in Italian of The Passing of Arthur, with quaint pictures of the three queens who came, in the legend, in a mystic barge to take Arthur to Avalon. I looked at the book with some astonishment. What interest could a down-going man have in a thing like this? Bennett was leaning over the table. He looked at me strangely. "Do you think a thing like that could happen?" he said. I told him that it never did happen in this world, that it was a fairy story, this tale of Arthur with the queens and Avalon. The ship captain said he was not so certain of it. He had known things just as incredible to happen. A fairy story couldn't beat it. It was no use to say a thing could not happen because it sounded like a fairy story. Take, for example, the things these men told here. They might be true, and they might be lies. Men in the Far East got infected with the Arabian Nights virus. But strange things, incredible things, did happen in the China Sea. Bennett sat over the tumbler of vile brandy, his arms heavily on the table. I didn't drink the stuff. I kept pouring it out on the dirty matting. It was a trick I had become deft in. One acquires skill when one must save oneself from poison. There was a new English label on the bottle. Too new. That label was printed somewhere in a cellar. And the liquid, only the devil knew what it was. Alcohol of some sort as a base with any cheap filler that would bite. Cheap was the idea. The Wu Fang Company was after the kick for the money. He spoke suddenly without moving. He prepared his words with an interjection, a sort of vocal comment. The sound one utters alone when one finally arrives at a conclusion or comes to the end of considering something incredible. "That story Chillingsworth told just now?" He made a correction. "Captain Chillingsworth." He spoke the words precisely. The talk, as I have said, had been on the mysteries of the sea, strange things that happen in out-of-the-way places of the world of water, indeterminate things that lie in the twilight country between dreams and the hard reality of life. The story that Bennett was thinking of was the story the English skipper related. The mystery of dreams had come into the talk. Dreams! The Englishman had repeated the word as one pronounces a formula which he wishes profoundly to consider. He was devitalized with opium, and the mere uttering of sound seemed a labor to him. But the voice went on in its weary monotony. "He was a trader, a dirty little beast of a trader, and he had a picture. It was a watercolor drawing of a bit of coast. It was a neat little dirty picture, but it was very clear in its details. One would have said that it was drawn and painted in from life. The coastline was as definite as a survey. The grove of coconut trees on its south point seemed placed with a sort of mathematical accuracy. The curve of the beach looked like a photograph. The sweep of the coral reef that bowed around the inlet was as precisely placed as though it had been taken from a chart. The marked place was between two of the coconut trees. I would have sworn that a geodetic survey had mapped it and some artist sketched it in. And yet," the tired voice drawled, "it was a dream. He said, the dirty little beast, that he saw it first in his dream, on the night he had to run for it. He had looted the firm of which he was a clerk, and he had to clear out. It was his one big job at the end of a crooked career, and he kept on seeing it in a dream, with that one spot marked between the two coconut trees. He could not draw the picture nor paint it in, but he could see it. He got so he could see it like a picture in a mirror, and finally he got a little half-cast to make the picture for him. It must have been a tedious business. It did take days on end, he said. But you must realize how well he knew the details. Of course, the picture wasn't entirely correct. He would explain it like an engineer explaining the slight errors in a blueprint. The coral reef wasn't such a perfect arc. It had a twist in it, and the top of one of those coconut trees was heavier than the other, and the stem thickened a bit more at the earth. He was very much concerned to correct the details, and he took a lot of trouble about it. You could not stop him. He'd crease the picture with his thumbnail and run after you to explain. The thing was real, that dream." There was no marked inflection in the tired voice that went on. "The little beast was written by this fixed idea. There was some sort of treasure buried between those two coconut trees, and its exact location had been revealed to him in a dream. The dream kept coming back with the regularity of a cyclic monomania of the mind. He would go at everybody that he could get to listen. He would divide the treasure with anyone who would go with him to find it. He said he had an instinct about the direction. There was never a human creature so possessed with a single fixed object in life. The little beast made his life a hell with it. He would work all day like a slave, unloading grain ships, carrying the bags up out of the hold, along with the coolies, and then he would tramp about at night doing anything about the brothels, with petty thefts thrown in. He did it for years until he finally got enough cash together to buy an old hull that had an engine in it, too dangerous for even the Chinese to risk a cargo on. He must have had the devil's time to pick up a crew, even the very few that he could get along with. For all his energy, the creature could not man the craft alone. There was an engine of sorts in the scale of a hull, and there was the navigation of the thing to manage. And too, there was the indefinite voyage that he was setting out on. He could not secure a crew from a port, but he did the thing in some fashion. After all, for a few dollars Mex, a dive leader would Shanghai a crew for him. And so he went to find his treasure, and he did find it. But it didn't turn out precisely as he expected. He was a bit off on what was buried between the two coconut trees. It turned out this way. The resident who was already on that spot of the coast wrote it in his report to the agent at Hong Kong. There was a storm, and the old craft beached on the reef and broke up. The little trader with the dream washed ashore with his lungs full of seawater, and the resident buried him at the marked place between the two coconut trees. Bennett took a drink out of the dirty tumbler. He sat back from the table, his big hands placidly linked together across his stomach. "Hell," he said, "that man was tricked into hunting for his own death. That was the long and short of it. He had a vision, a quest, and he was always longing to go on it, planning to go on it. Saved, starved, lied, stole, nothing too damned low. Finally, he has enough dollars, Mex, to get the Undertaker's stuff that they sold him for a ship. And he goes on his quest. Ghastly joke, all that trouble to get killed." He laughed, a sort of chuckle that undulated his body like a wave. He made one see what he was thinking, a pagan fate somewhere behind the world, chuckling as he was chuckling now over its little pleasantry with a fool of a mortal. Ha! It was the interjection again. It summed up his conclusion on the thing. It summed up also our conclusion. Man is altogether the sport of fortune, the ancients said. I wished to get him out of this reflection and into his own adventure. That would lead along to the thing I was after. I saw little in this incident bearing on anything that concerned me just then. Later, I remembered it. Not that it is a part of this story. It has nothing to do with this story. But you will recall it presently, just as I recalled it, not for itself, but because it has a vague resemblance to something that happened to another man. And you will see perhaps what I think I saw. The big notion under all religions. You see, this trader was a dirty little beast. Had been that from the cradle. He was so far over on the devil's side that even Bennett looked down on him. Think how far over that would be. But how about a man who wasn't on the devil's side? That was the vague relation I saw a little later on. You will understand that this was the English skipper Chillingsworth's story, the story I have just repeated. I recalled it in the intervals between Bennett's comments. I don't think he saw the bearing of it on the mystery that he was about to narrate, but perhaps he did see it in a way. At any rate, he turned sharp off into his own adventure. His voice changed. He spoke slowly, like one who wishes his words to be considered. I was coming up from the Malay Peninsula. I had a ship of the Wu Fang Company. Nothing to brag on. He made a slight gesture with the little finger of one of his hands. A great deal like the ship Chillingsworth's trader picked up. Mostly rust. There's one thing these damned Chinese know. The resistance of old iron. If the rust don't go through, they will take a chance on it. Of course, we are the men who take the chance. He included the room in a sweep of the eye. What's a white man's life to a Chinese trader? Of course, the cargo's something to him, he's concerned about that. But the crew and the skipper, if the sea gets them, why, damn the luck, and there's the accrued wages to the good. There's no executor to nose it out. And who's weeping on the dock for any white man in the service of the Wu Fang Company? There was a brief interval of silence, as though for a moment the man recalled the narrow margin that, in some dangerous experience, had barely saved him. We had shipped our cargo at sea, and were on the way north. We were loaded heavy. The old freighter was pretty deep in the water. Loaded too heavy, I thought. But that's neither here nor there. The skipper on the Dutch ship wanted me to carry a little stuff as a favor to him. And of course I did. The Freemasonry of the sea. He shot his head forward at me in a sort of gesture. I knew what he meant, a little crooked business on the side. Even the canny Chinese shipowner couldn't stop that. He would figure what his ship could carry, and the skipper would add a few bags or a few cases on his own hook. We were creeping north. No one could make time with that junk heap. The old engines in her knew what she could stand. Any sort of speed would have shaken the bolts out of her rusty plates, but the sea was like a floor, not a ripple on it. She chugged along in that glassy sea with the smoke hanging around her rusty stack. There wasn't any wind enough to carry the smoke away, but that was luck. I don't know what we should have done in a sea. Still, there's that resistance in old iron that I mentioned. The damned chinks can smell it out. We might have weathered a gale, but I didn't want to try, not with the weight we had in the rusty hull, and that's what kept me with a weather eye out and a finger up for a breeze. I knew the primitive test. I'd seen the Chinese sailors at it, to wet the finger and hold it up. It will feel cold on the side of the wind. And I could realize Bennett's concern. He had the old freighter overloaded. A squall might put her under. It was about noon, Bennett continued, when the thing began to happen. I was keeping a pretty sharp lookout. You see, we were out of the usual trade route north, a good distance west of it, and we had the sea to ourselves. I understood what he meant. He was running some sort of contraband. German rifles reshipped at sea, perhaps, or the devil knows what. And he was keeping out of the track of ships. He wanted the sea to himself, as he said it. He would keep a sharp lookout both for wind and ships. He went on. My reflection wasn't audible. The lookout gave me a signal of something west. Strange how sharp-eyed a native can be. Give me a chink in a crow's nest to see everything under the sky. He said there was a cloud appearing. That brought me up. I was at tiffin in the officer's cabin. I had ice and some bottles, a present from the Dutch skipper. I left them. I wanted to look at that cloud. But I couldn't make out anything, not even with a glass. The sea, as far as the eye could reach, was as clear as a plate of metal. There wasn't a ripple on it. I cursed the chink in the top and sent another up. He squinted about a bit and began to squeal. There was a tiny cloud to the west. He paused, fiddling the fingers of his folded hands. An hour later I saw it. I mean, with the glass. A speck of a cloud on the extreme horizon of the sea. I got a chair up and sat down on the bridge. That cloud troubled me. It would be a landstorm on the way out. If it hung together, it would be one of those dangerous tornadoes following a track. If we were in the track... He turned the thumb of one of his hands slowly down. It was a gesture more significant than any word he could have spoken. A gesture like the decree of a fate. There were a lot of islands to the west of us, some not charted, hardly any of them known. We were taking a chance on this route north. I shouldn't have risked it, perhaps, except for the Dutch skipper's bottles. After all, I wasn't there to insure the damned cargo. The long packing cases were marked mowing scythes from Bremen. That was the Wufang Company's business. I kept watching that cloud, that speck in the sea. It was right on the water. That would be the track of a tornado. But what puzzled me was that it did not seem to move. The cloud of a tornado ought to travel. It ought to travel like hell. I thought the thing must be smoke from a steamer. But it didn't look like any smoke that I had ever seen, and it didn't act like smoke. The chinks in the top jabbered at the suggestion of smoke. It was not smoke, and presently they began to jabber about the cloud. They hung out of the top like a pair of yellow jacks in a box. And finally they gave me another decision. It was a sail. He put his two big hands out on the table in front of him, as one might put out documents to prove a statement. They seemed, as one would say it, detached from the man. Then we noticed something that we had overlooked in the excitement. There was a bit of air moving, a faint breeze coming to us from the land. The thing was a sail. I saw it after a time. But there was something about it that didn't seem right in a sail. The chinks in the top marked it, and I could see it when the land breeze freshened. It looked heavy and formless. A sail ought to have a sharp outline. It was moving directly out toward the route of the steamer. It ought to cross our track north about dark if the breeze held. It was a damned curious thing, and I kept a watch on it. But I wasn't concerned about it. There was no threat in the bit of wind. We were not in for a storm, and a thing with a sail like that could only be some native craft beating about. That conclusion was correct, in part, I mean. It was a native craft when it came within reach of the glass, a Chinese sailing sampan of the common type along the coast. There was nothing unusual about the sampan. The thing that puzzled me, puzzled the chinks in the top, was the aspect of the sails on the crude rigging. They looked heavy and ponderous. The whole rigging seemed to be covered with a loose, thick, woolly sail, not drawn taut, but hanging as though it were draped over the rigging. I was astonished. I'd never seen anything like that on any sailing craft on any water in the world. But in the slight breeze it seemed able to carry the sampan slowly out into the open sea. He didn't move his hands now. They remained before him like two bags of coin before a player on a gaming table. I had only a native crew, no other white man. A native crew isn't curious. A thing has got to get out of the order of nature to get a native crew excited. But something about the sail on that sampan worked the Chinese up. It worked me up, too. I didn't give a fiddler's curse for the sampan. It would cross the route of the ship a mile ahead, and the night would take it. Could have it and be damned for me. Still, it puzzled me as I watched it, just as the chinks watched it. I could hear the jabber in the top, and there was a yellowhead everywhere about the deck. As the outline of the thing grew clearer, one could understand why the native lookout called the thing a cloud when he first saw it. It was a cloud. At any rate, it was no proper sail. It was something heavy and thick-massed around the rigging. A heavy cloud of some sort banked around the rigging. That was the impression I got, and that is what it was. I continued to watch it through the afternoon as the breeze carried the sampan out across our route ahead. It reached the line of the steamer ahead about sunset, and then a miracle happened. He rested his weight heavily on his hands and looked at me steadily across the table. You could call it only a miracle. I had my glass on the craft at the moment, and every chink was watching. That thick woolly cloud sail suddenly detached itself from the rigging of the sampan, lifted, and moved away. And it moved against the wind back toward the land from which it had come. He shot out his jaw. Against the wind! That would be a miracle. I saw it, and every native of the crew saw it. There was an audible murmur like a sigh over the whole ship. That oriental murmur of profound astonishment that one hears, perhaps, once in a life, as though the sea had opened. Bennett did not say very much about it, but I could understand the profound curiosity on the ship as the sampan approached under this strange sail. And when the cloud lifted and went back against the wind, the whole crew must have hung breathless. A yellowhead out of every hole on that ship, to get the earliest possible solution to this mystery. They understood clouds and wind. They were creatures of the sea. Clouds and winds were important to them. They studied them. They weighed the phenomena of them. They were vital factors. And when suddenly the definite order of nature was reversed, they were appalled. A cloud did not move against the wind. A thing like that had never been observed to happen since the world began. It was beyond every detail of their experience. It was beyond every experience from the beginning. As the winds moved, so did the clouds in heaven move. But here was a wind blowing from the land, and here was a cloud that lifted and went away in the opposite direction. It was a thing that reversed life. And it impressed this old primitive race more profoundly than any modern phenomena of mystery could possibly have impressed it. If there had been a dead man come to life, they would have been astonished. If they had seen an ancient woman growing back to her youth, they would have been amazed with it. But they could have explained it as being the protean quality of a drug, the result of some feat of a witch doctor, the spell of some manner of magic, or the thing white men accomplished with their miracle business. But there was no white man here except the captain of the ship, who seemed equally amazed with the thing. And there was no witch doctor. There was no magic. This was the sea that they traveled and dwelt on, as races travel and dwell on the land. This was the sea they knew. How could the order of nature get reversed here? There could be no explanation of it, unless the explanation awaited them on the sampan that they were overhauling. The sampan that now stood bare-rigged on the sea, motionless on the track of the route north. They approached it. It must have been the tensest sort of journey, the last hour of the old freighter as it chugged toward the mystery of the sampan. It is a marvel to us, to the people of any other race, that no effort was made to increase the speed of the freighter. That would be the inscrutable Oriental control of self. They must have been wild to know what was on the deck of the sampan, but it would be like this ancient race to move toward it with the usual calm. An English stoker would have coaled his ship and strained his engines. There would have been every form of hurry, but there was no change on the deck of the freighter, except that a yellow head popped out at every corner. Bennett was himself on the deck of the freighter, on the bridge of it, if this absurdity of a ship had a bridge. He kept a glass on the sampan. At the first distances, it seemed empty. Nothing moved on it. It seemed to undulate gently in the sea under its bare rigging. Bennett said he thought it was an abandoned derelict of a thing drifting about. Certainly there was no crew on it. They would be moving, baking some sort of signal. But there was no signal visible, and there was no motion of any living thing on the deck. He concluded finally that the sampan was abandoned. He said something like it. He called out to the men in the top, but they did not agree with him. They saw clearer with their naked eye, these Orientals bred to the visibility of the sea, than the exotic white man could, at once with his glass. They said there was something on the sampan, an indefinite something. Bennett tried to make it out, and finally he got it in the glass. It looked like a heap or bundle lying on the bare deck. That detail intrigued his curiosity. What sort of cargo could such a drifting craft carry? A mystery craft, convoyed by a sail cloud that lifted from its rigging and set aside by its axe the established laws of the universe. They could not make out what this cargo was as the freighter advanced, but the men in the top began to have some conception of it, or some theory about it. Usually silent, they began to chatter. Bennett did not inquire into their theory. Perhaps there was a bit of pride in this denial to his curiosity. Surely with a glass a white man could see as well as a half-naked yellow Asiatic in the top. At any rate, he could presently see as well, and presently he did see what the cargo was. It took a clearer outline. It became visible through his glass. Bennett sat back in his chair, looking down at his motionless hands on the table, his heavy face in a sort of reflection. "When we overhauled the sampan," he said, "it was standing motionless in the sea, no sign of a sail on its bare rigging. The only thing on it was an unconscious white man lying in the sun on the rotten deck." End of Chapter 1. Chapter 2 of The Revolt of the Birds by Melville Davisson Post. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Read by Ben Tucker. Chapter 2. Before I go into the strange details Bennett gave me when he picked up the Chinese sampan in the rout of his steamer that night, I want to get another thing before you. The story the German derelict captain told me in the club room of the Wu Fang Company. It is not a part of Bennett's story, but it bears upon it in one prime essential, and you will grasp the whole sweep of Bennett's narrative and its deeper meaning if you carry forward in your mind the controlling idea in Nordheim's story. Captain the Baron Nordheim, as Bennett addressed him. You see, as I have said, they were careful of distinctions. It was the only thing they had left, and this derelict might have been a baron. He might have been anything. One never knows. I did not look him up in the Almanac de Gotha, but the Almanac de Gotha records more than one down-going man stepping into the abyss. At any rate, he was an educated German. I don't know what sent him on his way to the Wu-Fang Company. There was a hint of it, I think, in the story he told. The story I am relating. He had been caught in a line and taken overboard from his ship. He could not swim. The line had played out and he had gone down. It was a smooth sea with clear green water, and he had descended slowly, he said, feet first and upright, turning a little, but maintaining this position. Persons on the deck could see him as he disappeared thus into the depths of the sea. It was a fragment of time before they could get the line taut. That was the point about the adventure. The very brief time involved. He could not have been more than 60 seconds in the sea, and yet, he said, in that period of time, he relived in every accurate detail a dramatic portion of his life. I think he meant the most disastrous portion of it. Perhaps the portion of it that sent him out of his class into the East, and finally into the club of the Wu-Fang Company. He related the incident in dramatic detail. One could see that it was a fragment of life, something the man had lived. Contracted to its essentials, he had been a student of the University of Gießen in the province of Hesse. There had been the usual complications with a woman. This Baron Nordheim must have been a fine type of young German in that day. The devitalizing East had not removed every evidence of it. One could see what the man had been. Such complications would ordinarily have been of no importance, but as it happened, the young woman was of the elevated class in Hesse, and one of her relatives took it up. He was a member of the Imperial Guard. He came down from Berlin, and there was a duel. Nordheim said in the brief period of his descent into the sea, he passed again through every detail of this duel. At 5 o'clock in the morning, they went out from Gießen and carriages to a student's clubhouse in a neighboring province. It was the usual spectacular duel so dear to the dramatic German sense. The two men were stripped to the waist and armed with sabers. They stood just opposite one another so that with the arm extending, a point of the saber could touch the opponent. To the eye, a duel so arranged would be a deadly affair, but the German race gets the maximum of dramatic effect with the minimum of peril in its tragic affairs. Two aides armed with sabers stood between the opponents, and the duelists were not permitted to move from their positions. The duel went on for some time with the appearance of a desperate affair, but it was stopped constantly. There was hardly a thrust of the saber that was not intercepted. If blood were drawn, the aides intervened and the surgeons consulted. Finally, the guardsman touched Nordheim on the forearm. An artery was cut and the duel ended. The thing would have been all in proper form but for the fact that real human emotions were involved. The girl was engaged to the guardsman. A word or two passed between the men at the end of the formal duel, and suddenly, before the managers of the affair could interfere, there was a moment of actual fighting. The guardsman was killed, and Nordheim had to get out of the Empire. The man did not precisely say this in the story, but he gave details enough to make it certain. It was the big tragic event at the turn of his life. He was a civilian. He had killed an officer of the Emperor's Guard. There was no chance that he would go clear of it. The only chance he had was to disappear, and so he came into Asia in the Wu-Fang Company. There is no relation in this incident to Bennett's adventure, except that it bears on a certain feature that will presently develop, the feature of time. That was the point Nordheim was making. That time was merely a condition of the mind. It could be suspended, or it could be strangely lengthened. Extreme peril in the presence of death could indefinitely extend it. A moment could be made to cover a long period of time. That was the point he made, and that is the point that bears on Bennett's story. As I have said, he could not have been longer than 60 seconds in the sea, and yet he had relived in every detail the experiences of his life for a very considerable period. Was time then strangely subject to human emotion? Thus, in a day, one might, under certain conditions of the mind, have the experiences and sensations of a lifetime. If the situation were tense enough, if the feeling were overpowering enough, time could be extended as one stretches an elastic band. Of course, Nordheim knew nothing about this story I got from Bennett, but his experiences for the brief period of time in the sea had set him to thinking about this condition of time, and a further experience made it almost an obsession with him. A sort of fixed idea that a German can so easily get absorbed into. This further experience, in fact, the really strange thing which he had started out to relate, had added to his interest in this idea. Somewhere, the actual situs of these wanderings were never precisely charted, up a sluggish river of the Malay Peninsula, there was a German resident. He was alone in this wilderness of Asia. It wasn't certain what the contraband was he traded in. Raw opium, perhaps. The Wufang Company had located him and had sent Nordheim in on one of its leprous ships to get the stuff he had to sell. That's the reason the spot on the coast remained indefinite in the man's story. The Wufang Company did not wish the world to know where precisely its doubtful customers were located, or the destination of its ships. But if the contraband which the resident sold to the Wufang Company was left in doubt, there was no doubt about what Nordheim took to the recluse in exchange: French champagne and hashish. The resident in his thatch house at the end of the sluggish river explained it to Nordheim. Hashish had a strange effect on the human mind. It lengthens one's conception of time. The resident said, "I get drunk, I take the drug, and so it happens that in one afternoon I enjoy myself for a month." It was a finger's touch on an immense mystery. A lost German in a forest of Asia was on the way to one of the greatest discoveries of the age. He had outwitted time. He had hit upon a plan to extend the pleasant periods of it. Nordheim said there was no doubt about the effects of the drug. It did extend the consciousness of time. Grave professors had experimented with it in the universities at Berlin. In half an hour one could traverse the length of Unter den Linden. But if one swallowed a portion of the drug, a very limited portion, one seemed a whole afternoon in that pleasant walk. Strange that this astounding quality in the Asiatic hemp should have received so little attention from the savants of the world. What an immense control one would have over one's life if one could extend, for a long period, brief, happy moments in it. Carry this incident in mind as we go forward with Bennett's amazing narrative. Bennett said there was nothing on the flimsy craft to take aboard but the man. That strange cloud, that sail cloud that had brought the sampan out, was a clean mystery, a thing like witchcraft, a thing out of the order of nature. A cloud does not travel back against the wind. Bennett said that if he alone had seen it, he might have believed himself under the delusion of a mirage of the sea. But every native of the crew saw it, and the appalling mystery of it overcame the abysmal reserve of the race. There was the profound comment of that murmur heard like a sigh out of the bosom of the crew. And there was another thing. There was an intent in the phenomenon of that cloud, a definite intent. It brought the sampan out to the steamer, and it withdrew when that voyage was accomplished. One could go just so far with coincidence, and then the human understanding balked at it. There was the old illustration. If one found 3 trees at an equal distance apart and standing in a precise line, that might be chance. But if one found 7 trees thus arranged, there was an intent behind it. Somebody had planted them. Chance didn't go ahead with a plan. Chance was a kind of accident. But this thing was no accident. That cloud moved to a purpose. The purpose of getting that white man to the steamer. And it did it. Then it went back against the wind. That was the thing that got his goat, as he expressed it. Got the goat of the crew. And he went on about it. Of course I was thinking of the bottles and the ice that the Dutch skipper had given him. But I got away from that rational explanation a moment later. I got away from it with a decided start. He began to describe the white man. And presently, in a flash, I knew him. It was Arthur Hudson. It took a profound effort to control my face, to control my amazement. Hudson was a missing man, but not one of the missing men I was after. There was no dossier entry for which he was wanted. He wasn't involved with a crime, but he was involved in a romance that had hung for its 7 days on the tongue of London. And then he had vanished out of all human knowledge. I knew all about it. There was a girl, of course, and I had what she knew, everything she knew, even the letters the man had written. She had made a clean breast of it to me, and I knew the details running out in every direction from the culminating dramatic incident. It's marvelous, it's incredible, how an efficient Secret Service can get at the very hidden details in a case when it goes carefully after them. And we had gone carefully after the details in this case. Hudson was an American of an important family, and at the time the earth swallowed him, he was rich. I shall have something in detail to say about this feature presently. And the girl was socially prominent in England. Rather too prominent, as it turned out. The other man, there was always another man in these triangles, was notorious. Lord X. I don't want to name him. Everybody knows his career and how it ended. Bennett was going on. He was discussing a philosophy. I did not follow him. He had deflected from the narrative into a rambling discussion on coincidence and design and events, with an endless array of examples. I was thinking back over Hudson's affair. He had visited in England as a boy, and in the country he had met this English girl. There had sprung up a youthful romance, and a sort of engagement. The girl then was one of those slim, fresh, wholesome youngsters that our English race can breed in its best country families. What London does to some of the finest of them later on, as it did to her, is enough to crucify the very souls in us. Hudson went home with this ideal of her firmly fixed. His father had died, and the estate was involved. In fact, there was only a string of bituminous coal mines as an asset, and they were going to pot, as such properties go to pot when there is no personal supervision by the owners. Arthur Hudson was the only heir, the only individual, in fact, living at his father's death. He wanted to marry this English girl and live in England. He was wild about her and the outdoor country life. But for this, he had to have money. He had to get his father's wrecked estate on its feet. And he went about it like a man. He sold the house on Long Island and went down into the coal region himself. It was an awful place to put in the days of one's life. The Long Valley was a pot of smoke, the river a stinking yellow drain. There were only the shacks of the miners to live in, the scum of southern Europe to talk with, women like beasts of burden, men like underground gnomes. It was awful. But there was firm fiber in the man, great stuff. The stuff of the builders of empires in him. He stuck it. 5 years in that hell. And the thing that kept him up was this English girl. I mean the ideal of her. It was the thing in his heart that held all this physical horror back from him. And the ideal became finer all the time. The man's worship polished it. He could endure this hell for a season because, from the smoke of its pit, he was going to the clean air of England, and to this lovely girl, fresh like a blossom. He thought of her in every moment of his waking life, but not in the unconscious sleep life. That was the thing he complained of. He never could see this girl in his dreams. He never could dream of her. He wrote it in his letters to the girl, the letters I saw. He did have a dream about a girl, a dream that kept coming back, always the same. But it wasn't this English girl that he saw in it. It was a girl that he had never seen anywhere. A slender, dark-haired girl, with a delicate, ethereal beauty, like a dryad in a sacred grove, or a fairy woman. A flock of birds moved always about her, settled on the earth beside her, arose beside her, convoyed her like a treasure. It was always the same. If he dreamed of a woman at all, it was always this woman. He poured it all out to his sweetheart in England. He resented this intrusion. He wanted to dream of her. But it was of no use to resent it. The thing was beyond his will. And here was another strange thing, the resentment at the parallel life. I mean the real and the dream life that alternated in this man's consciousness, was not confined to one. It lay equally in the two lives. Hudson's subconscious soul, if one may put it that way, in worship of this dream woman of the birds, resented and rejected the other worship of his conscious soul. The man lived in two worlds, and he was not the same man in them. At least, in his heart he was not the same man. But strangely, his introspections were the same in both. I mean, in method. He considered and he reflected in the one precisely as he considered and reflected in the other. And thus, considering in the one state, he could not understand his attitude in the other. Awake, he was in love with this girl in England, thought of her only, longed for her, and when the night came on him, he turned to the other, with a sort of shudder of the soul for what he had escaped. He could see then that this incomparable dryad moving with the birds was the one he longed for, was the one only woman in the world for him. That limitation is too narrow. The one only woman in time, in space, for him. There was no doubt about it. Something like the drunken confusion of a drug would clear away, and he seemed to see clearly that the other obsession was a sort of derangement of the soul. Then the day would come, and this whole life would withdraw into the region of the fancy. It was this day life that prevailed. It would always prevail in such a conflict. We are creatures of the sun, and what appear in it are the realities of the world to us. The innumerable unstable states of the mind, in the vast realm of dreams, do not move us to their will with the insistence of our waking impressions. Nevertheless, they profoundly impress us sometimes as of a deeper significance than the waking phenomena that we call life. Our old mysterious religions teach that it was through the vehicle of the dream that the soul of man received its vital message, as though the withdrawal of sense impressions put the human mind in a closer touch with the intelligence behind the world. It's all inconceivably mysterious. Letters went on. The English girl was amused to keep Hudson thinking of her as a country innocent. He got no idea of the change that was going on, the smart, fast life she was getting into, the descent. Then he sold out, got a fortune in an American bank, and came to England. He did not tell his sweetheart he was coming. The strike of fortune and the sale of the properties and his coming for her was to be a surprise. The surprise was on the other side. I may as well write it all out here. Why tone it down? It's the truth. Hudson called up the country house when he got to London. They gave a woman's club in the city. The club said the girl was out for the weekend at Earldmere House. He asked a man he knew in his club about it. He said, "If you have a birdie in that nest, you had better cut along." Hudson thought he meant the distance. The man added a word or two. "The ant's a sound sleeper." Hudson got the route to the house from a road map, picked up a motor, and drove out. It was no great distance, only an hour or so out, but a tire went down. There was a lot of trouble. No spare case, it seemed, or something of the sort. At any rate, it was rather late when he arrived. Too late to go in, he thought. But he was crazy to see the girl. To see the house that held her would be something. He bade the motorist wait, and he walked up. It was a heavenly night. There was no moon, but the whole heaven was white with stars. It was a night designed in paradise, for a long-absent lover to come home to his sweetheart. Hudson was surprised at a turn of the path to see lights in the house. He thought it would be one of the country houses that shut up early, from what his friend said of the ant and to cut along. It seemed to be a drawing-room that was lighted. The other parts of the house were dark. He advanced on the path, and presently he caught the sound of faint music and noises. There was a French casement door opening from the lighted drawing-room onto the lawn. It was ajar, and Hudson went in. You see, the charm and surprise moved him. The girl would go red and white and breathless when he appeared. Poor devil. I would like to leave the rest of it out, but it is a part of this complicated truth. It's a fragment of this history of a life. Things happen, and one has to face them. A surgeon doesn't draw back before a malformation of the body, and it's a demonstration in the new philosophy, the philosophy of experiment, that the generation coming up has got in its head. I've no comment to make on it. The girl told me what happened when she showed me Hudson's letters, and made a clean breast of it. She had gone out to spend the weekend at Earldmere House. At dinner, Lord X had a bottle of champagne brought in. The old aunt objected. Young girls were not offered champagne in her day. There was a bit of protest from the Englishman, and the girl smiled. But the wishes of the old aunt were respected. The man put the champagne back into the ice. He made a little amusing gesture, a lift of the eyebrows, as one would say, "Oh, well, let it go for the present." That was the first act in the drama. The second came after dinner in the drawing-room, when Lord X set a record of American jazz on a Victrola and put back the rugs. The old aunt made another protest. It was no proper music for a drawing-room, and no proper dance for a young girl. X shut off the record. He made the same gesture, a sort of signal, as among conspirators. They had a rubber of bridge, a dummy for fourth, and the evening ended. Everybody took a candle and went up, but the girl had a hint of a plan. It was added to the Englishman's good night with the candle. "Aunt sleeps like the dead. Read a bit." She did read a bit, took off her evening dress and the tight things, as she put it. There was a light by the bed and some French novels, not any that one could purchase at a newsstand. The illustrations, the girl said, intrigued her. She read propped up among the pillows. An hour later, she heard a light tap on the door and X's voice. "Slip on something and come down." She slipped on a dressing gown. She made a point about that in her story, not about the conventionality of the garment, but about the lure of it. It was a Paris creation. She looked at herself a moment as she passed the mirror. She thought she was stunning in it. She found Lord X with the bucket of ice in the drawing room and the champagne. There were 2 bottles in it now. They drank it. He had the rugs back and they tried the American jazz record. He had a table cover over the Victrola to soften the sound. The girl laughed at the way he played the part. Of course she understood the man's Victorian aunt was a joke. All London knew about the little play acting. It was part of the game. Gave it a tone, you see, as she said it. But it was getting a bit overdone. He would have to get a new stunt. This was on the way to being standardized. She laughed. That was the thing that affected me in her story. The way she regarded the trick. It wasn't what one did, it was the way by which one came to do it. To be cleverly managed was the point. Was the whole point. Of course, one was never misled. One respected the fiction if it were clever. She indicated the formula. One must give an affair the aspect of romantic accident. Then Arthur Hudson stepped through the door into the drawing room. The girl said she was dancing with Lord X when, over his shoulder, she saw the man. She did not see him enter. She saw him standing just inside. She didn't know how long he had been inside. The Englishman was getting a bit out of hand. He might have kissed her just then or the moment before. She stopped and the Englishman turned. He went at Hudson with a rush. She said Hudson did not move, did not look at the man. He stood looking at her, his eyes wide, his mouth gaping. He never did seem to look at Lord X. When the man reached the door, he struck him with his clenched hand, but he did not look at him. It was a terrific blow. It crushed out Lord X's nose all over his face. No surgeon could ever restore it. It broke out the front teeth in both the upper and lower jaws, and it damaged the muscles of the left eye so that it was drawn down for life. That was one thing in the tragedy that the girl seemed to admire. That terrific right-hander. She laughed. It spoiled his profession. It did. He wasn't pretty to look at after that. He slid entirely across the drawing room into the opposite corner. The girl said it was some moments before she knew Hudson. She was a bit dizzy and objects weren't quite clear. She didn't move. She kept putting her hair back from her face. She had a great wealth of straw-colored hair. She was a beauty of the loveliest English type, and she knew it. That was another point about her. She enjoyed observing what this beauty did to men, the reactions from it. She was looking for the reaction of it even now on Hudson. Think of it, at the crisis of such a tragedy. But what do I know about women? What does any man know about them? She thought she was lovely, and she was. And she waited for Hudson to speak, to come to her. He didn't move. She wondered about it when she told me. How could any normal man hold out like that against the lure of her? She may have been mussed a bit. Lord X was a normal man. The dressing gown may have fallen away on either side from her shoulders, but clothes are a lure. That's the object of clothes. One wore a single garment before the whole world nowadays on the beach at Deauville, and she had 3, counting the dressing gown for one. She thought she was a beauty that night. A beauty just then. What was the matter with this American? Did I know? He did not move, but all at once he changed. His face changed, or else she finally saw him clearly through the haze that she was trying to put back, with that gesture toward her hair. He stood now, a relaxed heap against the door. He looked bewildered. Puzzled, uncertain, bewildered. There isn't a word to describe it precisely. He looked as the soul of a man might look if some awful accident had suddenly ejected it out of his body, and it did not know what to do. That's precisely it. That's precisely how the man looked. I got that profound impression from her description of him. She did not speak to him. She was waiting on the lure, waiting on the charm of her to move him. But he spoke finally. His voice was low, as though it came from a long distance. What he said was, "The other. Perhaps I can find her." And he went out. I am compelled to give you this incident in its detail, if you are to understand the sort of man Hudson was. The girl kept coming back to her query about him in our talk. What was the matter with the American? Did he expect to crack a roc's egg and find a woman within it? The world had changed. The new generation had made up their minds to live all they could in the time they had. And the more experiences one had, the more reactions, the more one lived. Did he expect to find her waiting for him, a little country innocent in a blossomed pasture? In what sort of sarcophagus had the man been entombed? It was the day of women. Women had come into their inheritance of freedom at last, and they proposed to make the most of it. Life was too precious to be risked blindly as it was too precious to be wasted. Imagine going to live with a man for one's life, when one knew nothing about a man. Did any man of us enter an irrevocable situation until after he knew, pretty thoroughly, all about it? And experience was life. Look at the thing. If one had an afternoon to see all the pictures in a gallery, would one spend the whole of it before a single picture? One would see the gallery, and then if one preferred a certain picture in it, one might come back to sit comfortably on a lounge before it, for any time that one had over. What could one know of life if one knew only one man, one picture? Look at the waste of it. She was right. There was something the matter with Hudson. He belonged in another world, in another conception of life, and he disappeared out of this new one that had arisen. Did he find the other? I was keen to get Bennett back into his story. I was so engrossed with the memory that I had hardly noticed that Bennett's voice had ceased. He was sitting quite still now, but he had been at the brandy bottle while I was in my reflection. It was empty. I got him back into his story. He had taken the unconscious man onto the deck of the steamer, abandoning the sampan to the sea. He had fortunately the bottles and the ice. He put a mattress on the deck for the man. It was still hot. The land breeze was gone. There was not wind enough now to move the sampan out of the track of the steamer. He set a native to keep a towel wet in cold water on the man's head, and he got some brandy in him, a teaspoonful at a time, but he never did get him back to more than fitful consciousness. And in these intervals Bennett got his story out of him. He got it in fragments that did not go together either in sequence or in time, but in a sort of way Bennett could fit them together himself. The man went through the night in his delirium, and the next day they rigged up a shelter over him on the deck, some old canvas to keep the sun off. The man seemed greatly disturbed when they tried to move him into the cabin. Even in delirium he fought against it. He wanted to remain on the open deck, and he had his way. I put the query that ran before the story. What became of Hudson? Bennett sat looking at the empty brandy bottle. I took the hint. The slippered old Chinese waiter shuffled in again. Bennett dribbled the brandy into his dirty glass, as one might measure out the treasure of a vintage. The man had disappeared from the deck of his ship in the night. He did not know what had become of him. He thought at the time that the man had rolled off the deck into the sea, but he wasn't so certain about it, and the older he got and the more he thought about it, the less certain he was. Maybe what the delirious man said would happen to him had in fact happened. He stopped abruptly as though a sudden profound reflection had seized him. I took advantage of that to pour my measure of the brandy on the dirty matting. When I looked up, Bennett's face was turned toward the window. He made a gesture toward it with his thumb. He indicated a sparrow outside. The sparrow was picking a caterpillar from the lid of a packing box. "God," he said, "a man's a fool to think that he can see and understand all that's going on around him. He doesn't even see what he could see, if he looked, not to mention the mysteries. He doesn't see the danger he's in from that thing." He jerked his thumb toward the lid of the packing box. "Our fate's in it. We talk about the end of the Great War. God, we're in the greatest war that the human mind ever dreamed of. No conception of war ever equaled the one we are in, the one that goes on day and night. No quarter, no armistice. A deadly, ruthless, determined struggle for possession of the earth, with extermination for the vanquished. Extermination! We can't patch up a peace with this enemy. We can't even patch up a truce. It goes on. If we win, we live. If we lose... He put out the fingers of his big hand, and then closed them slowly. He could not have made a more forcible gesture. He went on. You can't reason with this enemy. It doesn't reason. It goes on. A thing that we simply can't get at. The will to victory. We used to hear a lot about that in the German war. But this enemy has the instinct to victory. Think of that. You can't break down the morale of an instinct. It's outside of propaganda. Outside of fear. Outside of panic. Death don't touch it. Disaster don't touch it. God. He repeated the thumb jerk toward the window. Man has one great ally. It may save him. The birds. But for the aid of this ally, the great insect life would overrun the world like a wave. In a year, every green thing would vanish. There wouldn't be a leaf or a grass blade. The human race would be driven to the sea for food. It would have to dig in to live. It couldn't hold out. In a dozen years, it would cease to exist. There was a tense vigor in the man's words, but there was no vigor of declamation in his voice. He sat stooped over in his chair, and he spoke like one idly in reflection, one who wasn't concerned about an effect. I was puzzled. What sort of a tangent was he on? I meant so far as Hudson and the mystery about him was concerned, but the vivid pictures he created gripped me. One saw what he meant. Of course, everybody had thought idly along the line. But who had ever realized the immensity of it? If our ally failed us, he shrugged his big shoulders. They alone check the advance of this loathsome conqueror. They hold the line. If the enemy breaks through, we're doomed. And we don't give a thought to them. We don't even know the war's on. He paused. And we see 50 million tons of insects shift from one sector to another point of attack. We see a dozen cubic miles of space filled with the enemy in some sudden drive on us, and we leave our fate to the birds. I thought Bennett was drunk. I thought he had gotten into one of those ruts of the mind common to men in liquor. But he was not drunk. How he sat up under that terrible brandy was a wonder. But he did sit up under it. The only effect of the drink that one could notice was that he became a little more precise in his expressions, and a little more mysterious. He made a gesture with his hand toward the window, either to dismiss the subject which he had elaborated, or to include it with the story he returned to. He came back to the unconscious man on the deck of his ship, muttering in the shadow of the rotten canvas. He began to talk about him. How had he come here? What had happened to him? There was no white man on any island of this sea, and this craft had not come from the wreck of a ship. No ship would carry a rotten sampan on its davits. It came out from the land under the mystery sail. Bennett continued to do all he could to get the man on his feet, but it was no go. He got some broth in him and the spoonfuls of liquor, and now and then he got some fragment of his story. One could visualize the thing, the curious ship captain sitting by the delirious man, noting every word, considering every gesture and expression and putting it together, as one puts together the fragments of a puzzle. Now giving it up as a fantastic vagary, and then coming back to it for the truth. There was one thing in the fragments that Bennett got that struck me with the impact of a blow. The man said that there had been a woman with him on the sampan. That fragment had a marked significance for me. It connected Hudson with the affair I detailed a moment ago. It completed his adventure with the English girl. One thought instantly of his last significant sentence when he was standing by his dead self in the door of Lord X's drawing room. The other. Perhaps I can find her. Had he found her? Or was it merely that persistent dream coming out in the delirium? How could there have been a girl with him on this rotten sampan at this point in the China Sea? Was it the dream again? If it were that, here was a parallel for Chillingsworth's traitor. the same ending. I thought it was the brandy in Bennett at the time that made him so complacent, so willing to accept the mystery in Hudson's disappearance, to believe what the man said in his delirium. But it was not the brandy. I can believe it, and I do not drink the brandy of the Wu-Fang Company. Hudson said that there was a girl with him on the sampan, and that she had gone away in the cloud that had made a sail to bring the sampan out to the ship. He said the cloud would come for him. That was the reason he fought, even in his delirium, for his open place on the deck. Did it come for him? Bennett kept putting that query as he got on with the story. At any rate, the man was gone one morning when Bennett came out on the deck. The native lookout said a thick cloud passed the ship, but as Bennett said, any native would be sure to add a wonder of his own to the rest of these wonders. End of Chapter 2. Chapter 3 of The Revolt of the Birds by Melville Davisson Post. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Read by Ben Tucker. Chapter 3. Bennett pieced out Hudson's adventure on his way north. He was idle on the ship, and this strange affair gave him something to do. I could see him on that dead water, under a sky that did not change. The rusty freighter leprous in the sun, putting the thing together as one puts together the tiny fragments of a letter torn to bits. One spreads them all out on a table before one, and goes at what seems a hopeless task. But the man had the time and the motive, and he got a sort of unity in the end out of the fragments. Of course, the details would not be precisely correct. One had to supply missing parts, and yet he had from his basket of scraps now and then an incident of startling detail. Like the scene on the sea before his ship came up, and segments that were mostly blank, dark places that could not be filled, could not, in fact, be imagined. What happened to Hudson immediately after he disappeared out of London that night? How he had got into Asia and so forth. Bennett gave it all up beyond a certain point. He worked forward from an event on the sea, taking that event for a beginning. He did not endeavor to go back of that event. It was the thing that seemed to stick in the memory of the delirious man. He had been set adrift in the sampan from a ship, Bennett thought. That was all the story at first. The man had been set adrift, and he had picked him up. But he saw later it was the beginning of the whole thing. This is how Bennett finally worked it out from the vague data he had. It was conjecture, merely a sort of theory, but something of the sort seemed to be indicated. Something of the sort was at the origin of the thing. At any rate, it made what one might call a working hypothesis. Hudson was looking for something. He was searching the world for it. How he had got into Asia and how he came to set out on his quest, and what the quest was, were dead points to Bennett. He could not get them precisely coupled up. He could not piece out this portion of the story. But he had a marvelous memory. He gave me the fragments out of Hudson's babble. He did not know precisely what they indicated, and he did not join them up, but to me they were signboards along the way of the man's adventures. I had all that went before. Bennett did not understand these fragments from Hudson's talk, but I could put the whole thing together. He had set out on a quest, and he had a sort of instinct about it. I don't think that, in the beginning, the instinct led him. I think the first thing was the flight of panic. To get out of London was the idea. To get away. To get as far from that cursed city as the earth would permit him to go. And so he crossed Europe into Asia. That would be the first impulse. To put all the distance one could between the city of this tragic disaster and himself. Between the wreck of his life and the future. Then, when he had got some hold on himself, he would go about the search for the other woman. And perhaps that quest was not entirely a vague wanderlure. Chillingsworth's trader said that he had an instinct about where the island was that he saw in his dreams. Perhaps Hudson, too, had some sort of instinct about where the thing was that he sought. It doesn't get us anywhere to reject such a theory with a smile. When one has a profound feeling, there may be some lure of direction in it. What is it that guides the birds in their migrations, and the schools of fish that travel in the sea? It must be some sort of instinctive direction toward the thing they seek. Of course, it would be a mystery, but are we not surrounded, hedged in by mysteries? Do they not lie in every direction? We have no adequate explanation for any one of them. Are not the very ablest scientists constantly presenting us with mystery? An old naturalist in the south of France brings a cocoon, containing a moth, into Provence from a distant part of Europe. He brings a single one. There is no moth of that species in this part of France. He screens it in a room and hatches it out, and on a day when it reaches a certain period of maturity, there appears a mate for it at the window. The thing is incredible. It is beyond belief. It is beyond explanation. But it happens, and it is true. The old naturalist has no explanation to offer. What living man can have an explanation to offer? How could a moth, in a distant part of Europe, know that another would be hatched out in a screened room in Provence and travel across the hills and valleys to it? And how could the moth carried into captivity by the naturalist in its dormant state, when it awoke to life, call a mate out of the faraway world to it? The thing appalls us. It staggers the human mind. We can't explain it. It may be beyond reason, if one likes, but it is not beyond faith that Hudson had, unconsciously perhaps, some instinct of direction about the thing he sought. Why should a moth in Provence possess a mystery of direction that the human soul is denied? The man was dominated by an intense longing, a longing that cannot be gauged by any little measure, a thing like the pull of the stars, like the pull of the earth on its satellite. This dream life had been half of the man's existence. It was now the whole of it. Is there any wonder that he finally got on the way to the thing he sought? Bennett said that if anything existed in Asia, there would be a rumor of it somewhere. That's the truth. Any man with any experience of the East knows that. The English discovered it again and again in India, when there were no means of communication, no telegraphs, no flash signals, nothing. There would be a rumor among the natives in the cities of the coast about battles on that day in the interior. If there was a fight anywhere in the hills, something would be known of it, although it was not possible to have any direct means of communication. No one understands this. It is one of the phenomena of mystery. And so it happened that somewhere on the coast Hudson got a rumor of a white woman and the birds, and he set out to find her. Perhaps we have a hint of the thing in what we call the affinity of elements, the lure that a grain of metal has for another grain, the leap of steel filings to a magnet. Might not that mystery of attraction be extended across the world, across space? Hudson had then hired a Chinese crew with a ship of sorts to take him on the search for the girl. When they arrived near to the point of destination, somewhere on the south coast, the native crew refused to land. There were all kinds of trouble, but the Oriental obstinacy held. They would not go ashore. The ship was apparently standing out to sea off some point on the coast. The coast, as Bennett said earlier in his story, is practically unknown. No law runs, and it is dotted with islands, not charted, undiscovered, in fact. He could not precisely understand what was wrong, why the crew went into mutiny here. There would be some powerful reason for that. A Chinese trader usually keeps his word, and the ship must have been had from some sort of trader. The devil's contention went on for a night with the ship standing out to sea and the coast visible to the west. Anyone with a knowledge of the East, with an experience of the Oriental, can picture the desperate position in which Hudson found himself when the ship that he hired to adventure on his quest would not go into the coast. He could make out this coast, with the eye faintly in the distance. And on it, somewhere, was the one he sought, if the instinct in him was correct, that instinct of the soul which remains so profound a mystery. He had not only that intense feeling to direct him, but he had also a rumor that had come to him in Asia. There must have been a very definite rumor about this girl, currently in the waste places of the East in which he had been wandering, definite enough to give a location to the point of land toward which the course of the ship had been directed. There seemed to be no doubt about the fact that the one Hudson was seeking was somewhere behind the dim coast outline that emerged vaguely from the sea on its western horizon. These details came out in the man's delirium. They gave a framework for the picture that one could so easily visualize. It must have been the devil's situation for a man like Hudson, a man who had been following a dream that his whole life was absorbed in, that embodied now every hope, every fortune of the future. A thing that had been a vague fancy, a thing that could be only imagined, that had no reality, that had no place in the actualities of existence. Now, on this day, with the mainland to be outlined in the distance, had become a part of life. It had hardened into fact. It had moved from a fairy kingdom of dreams into the land of living men. This woman that he sought was not a fancy then. She was not a fairy creature imagined in an extravaganza of the mind. She was a living woman, and to the west, beyond the strip of placid sea, she awaited him. Then at the very hour when his hand was extended to touch her, he was held up by this wall. The ship stopped. It was easy enough to imagine that scene. The Oriental crew would not be above board with their resistance. The Oriental does not come out, like the English sailor, with a determined stand against you. The engines of the ship would stop. The impatient white man would make an inquiry. He would be told that something about the engines was broken down. He would be met by obsequious apologies. The broken engine would be speedily repaired. He would be assured that his wishes would be carried out. If he were not familiar with the East, he would be deceived by this. Perhaps for a time he was deceived by it. One going into Asia from the West would take these expressions in their literal meaning. He would expect them to be carried out. He would know later what they meant. Bennett would have known instantly, or any of the white men in the service of the Wufang Company. Of course, an engine might break down. An accident could easily happen to the engines that must have been in the ship Hudson picked up. Any accident, in fact, might have happened to it. But it was certain that there was a delay here for the man, not the result of any accident. Somewhere in the haze of delirium, Hudson said the crew mutinied. That, in plain terms, would be the actual fact. That Chinese crew had decided not to go into this coastline. Hudson discovered that fact a little later on. It is probable that for the moment, perhaps for the duration of a day, he was misled by the excuses they gave him. But he must have discovered presently that there was no substance in those excuses. The ship stood out in the sea while the crew pretended to repair the engines. Hudson sat on the deck looking at the line of the coast. He was certain now to reach it. His ship would presently go on. In an hour or two he could go ashore. He must have had a vast upward sweep of the heart at the contemplation of it. Before the sun set, he would be in the land of the fairy woman and the birds. He never had a doubt about it. That fact, Bennett said, was constantly evident in his delirium. But the ship did not go on. The insistence of the white man must have made itself felt then. It would certainly make itself presently felt. He would not have remained an afternoon in his chair. He would have finally gone to inquire about the engines. He would have sent for his Chinese skipper. One can visualize that official clearly enough to make a painted watercolor. He would wear a cap of the German merchant marine, and there the uniform of the service would stop. He would have the usual Chinese garment, and he would go barefoot. But he would be very polite and apologetic. He would explain the accident to the engines. The explanation would avoid details. But he would assure the white man that the ship would go on. When he was pressed for the hour at which this happy event would take place, he would have recourse to the vague gestures of the East and its vaguer expression. "No can tell, Excellency." It is a useful expression with the Oriental when he does not mean to tell, or when there is nothing in fact to tell. Night would have fallen, and the ship would have stood out in its same position in the sea. Its deck would have been deserted. Hudson would have found himself alone. A Chinese crew has the quality of rats. They can disappear in a moment. At the sound of one's voice, a whole crew can vanish. It can disappear into a ship as vermin disappear into a wall. With the night lying on the sea, Hudson would find himself on what appeared to be an abandoned ship. He would have discovered nothing. If he happened on to one of the crew, the ubiquitous creature, after every kind of apology, would slip away from him. If he found the skipper, he would have found the smiling Oriental profuse in his explanations of regret. Explanations always with the same Delphic expression. "No can tell, Excellency." It would be a night of long anxiety for the man. Fear would present itself. The dread of something behind this extraordinary accident that was given to him for an excuse. Finally, a suspicion would arise, and when the morning finally dawned on the sea, he would understand. He must have understood finally. The expressions in his delirium make that certain. Then he would come to realize that the ship would not go into the coast. He must have been profoundly puzzled when he did come finally to understand it. That land vaguely to be made out in the distance was an island. But it was an island enveloped in some sort of horror. He could not make out just what this horror was. There was something there that put the fear of death into this Chinese crew. What was it? The man would have no conception of the real fact about it, and he would get no definite idea from the indirections that an Oriental would be sure to give him. But it was something that no man dared to face. He presented every inducement to the Chinese skipper. He would double what he had offered for the ship. When he began to realize that the crew would not go on, the first explanation that would appear to him was that he was being held up for a higher price. The thing had every aspect of that sort of blackmail. That would be a convincing reason, and it would not be out of character in Asia. One coming into the Far East would hit at once on that explanation. Bennett would have rejected it. The Chinese trader, even the skipper of such a ship, would be strangely honest about his bargain. Such a subterfuge would not have occurred to him. The man doubtless honestly wished to go on, to carry out his contract with the white man if he could, but no inducement that could be offered would move the crew. Panic had enveloped it. Neither force nor the lure of money would move it. Then a strange thing happened. A thing that Hudson, new to the East, thought strange. A thing not strange to the Wu-Fang Company. The Chinese skipper offered to return the money that Hudson had paid for the voyage. The crew would not go into this land of terrors. He would go back to the port from which they had sailed. He would return the white man to the very spot from which he had stepped onto the ship. He would return his money to him. In fact, offered the gold in a bag to him. The discussion went on until midday. This bitter, desperate struggle between the will of the white man and the terror of the crew. But he was not a man to be turned back from the thing he wanted. He was not to be held up by a fear of death, by a fear of anything. And so finally he made his decision. If the crew would not go in, he would go in himself. There was a bare-rigged sampan on the excuse of a ship. There would be no boat on its davits. The thing would probably be fastened on the deck. Something to be called a boat in the ship papers. There would always be papers of a sort. The Chinese skipper must have labored to persuade Hudson from this mad adventure. He would find something awful on that island. He did not undertake to define it. Perhaps he did not know what it was. Some horror of death sure to destroy anyone who would go ashore on it. He would fall back on the idiomatic expression. "No can tell, Excellency." It is certain, at any rate, that they put Hudson overboard in the sampan to drift ashore, or he went of his own will. Bennett didn't know. There were suggestive hints, in Hudson's wild talk, that there was a current running that would beach the sampan when it got in the drift of it. The Chinese skipper, or whatever the Chink called himself who had charge of Hudson's ship, knew this. He put the sampan afloat in this current. It would drift in if the mad white man was determined to go ashore on this cursed hell of an island. It is impossible to think of a situation more tragic than this. Hudson alone on the deck of the sampan, drifting with the current toward this island of mystery. He must have been, in some degree, impressed with the immovable fear of the Chinese crew. He could not wholly reject it. The Oriental is sound when you get to the base in him. When he acts, he has always a good and sufficient reason for it. He's not a creature of whims. I suppose Hudson thought that he was facing one of the vagaries of a superstition, but he must have had some concern beyond that. No man ever voyaged on a wilder adventure. Even Chillingsworth's trader had a definite picture of the port he sailed for. Hudson had no conception of this outline of land toward which the sampan drifted. There was something awfully wrong with it. That was all he knew, except the one big fact that he had to land on it to find his woman of dreams. It was like an Arabian Nights story. A dragon guarded this coast. But what sort of dragon? He never could get a hint of that out of the Chinese crew, or the inscrutable skipper under his German cap. The Oriental mind seemed to scamper back into its hole in the wall when he tried to drive it in on this mystery. But it was definite on one essential point. Death awaited any human creature that landed. All the circumlocutions of the Oriental jabber drifted back to that. Hudson must have considered a thing so definite. Was it going into just that? Death? The reflection must have given him some concern. The life he was seeking to enter had not been a life of reality. Perhaps the only way to it was the way out. There was another thing about this tragic situation that puzzled Bennett, and, at first, it also puzzled me. How did Hudson expect to get back to the ship? To go adrift in that bare-rigged craft seemed an utter abandonment of himself to the sea, to death, to whatever fate awaited him. It was clear enough from the side of the Chinese skipper. Why bother about a man who was going to his death? That would be Oriental common sense. One who could not come back would need no way planned for a return. And so, like a practical person, he put out to sea with his ship when the night shut down. That would be the Chink's side, as Bennett summed it up. He was uncertain about Hudson's side of it. He may have got a promise from the Chinese skipper to stand by and take him off if he were able to signal the ship from the coast. That would be the practical thing to do. And the Oriental would have made that agreement. Made it to break it. To keep it would be to accomplish the sort of folly that the sound, practical, Asiatic mind does not waste time over. Keeping faith with a dead man. Of course, there is the further theory that Hudson was burning his bridges. Bennett rejected that. But I do not reject it. He would share in the fate of his woman of dreams. She was the only thing he had. He had gone practically out of life to seek her. He was given up everything for this dream. In fact, it was no longer a dream. It was the one reality. Everything else, all the life we call reality, was illusion to this man. I could understand it. But picture the thing, drifting with that sampan, alone, slowly, in a sea current, into some form of horror that set a whole Chinese crew squealing when they thought about it. The Chink was right. The sampan landed about an hour before sunset. And the crew was right. Hudson was appalled with the aspect of the island as he approached it. He got an ever-increasingly better view of it as the current carried him in. The whole sweep of the island looked like the wreck of a world. It looked devastated as by some hideous toxic blight. There wasn't a tree, shrub, or green living thing on it. And the point was, the appalling point, that it had been originally a fertile, cultivated green island, ranking rich in this tropical sea. Hudson, from the deck of the sampan as he approached, thought the island had been gassed, as one might say. That is, some volcanic actions had released a toxic sulfur vapor through a crevice or the like, and the whole island, so to speak, had been gassed. That was the only explanation that occurred to the man. The only explanation possible. He began to look out for a breath of this vapor, some evidence of it in the air as the sampan drifted in, but he could detect nothing. That fact gave him a profound concern. Would this toxic gas be of some unknown chemical constituency, and odorless? Such gases were not wholly unknown to science. There might be such a deadly gas in nature and escaping here. Then he recalled that there were, in fact, certain heavy toxic gases that lay close to the earth, making in certain portions of the world what were called death zones. Dogs and low-standing animals died in these. A man on a horse would sometimes pass unharmed. He concluded that this was the correct solution of the mystery. It accounted for the hideous devastation of all forms of vegetable life, and for the deadly fear of the Chinese crew. These death zones had in all quarters of the world an appalling terror for the native mind, death coupled with some malicious devil purpose. This theory went to pieces when the sampan beached. Hudson saw it when he waded ashore and hawsered the sampan to a point of rock. The island had a form of life creeping over it. It was matted with insects, like a rotten carcass. They were everywhere, in millions, in numbers beyond any computation known, even to the magnitudes of celestial mathematics. The whole island crawled, reeked with insects. They met the man at the water. He crushed through them to get up the beach. They swarmed around him, spread over his feet, his legs, and he retreated into the sea. The hawser of the sampan was over a point of rock, standing out in the water from the beach. He waded back to its clean deck, clearing the insects from his body in the salt water. He sat down then to consider what he would do. Evidently there was no living thing in this awful place except this loathsome cover of insects that was matted over it. The Chinese crew were right to mutiny. It was a death island. A death island more awful than anything that could occur to the human fancy in its wildest nightmare. The living creature that went ashore on that island would meet the most loathsome death possible to imagine, enveloped in that crawling mass and devoured by it. The horror was inconceivable. The man was appalled. He had landed on the shore of a hell. And he stood there on the deck of the sampan trying to comprehend in some degree the magnitude of the horror. He searched the whole sweep of land. It had been a beautiful thing once in this tropic sea, a paradise of a thing. And now it was a loathsome carcass of a world, festering with things that crawled. There could be no human creature in this ghastly hell. But there was. Hudson saw smoke to the west, a thin thread of blue climbing into the sky. It was along the coast at the edge of the sea and obscured by a rising shoulder of the island. The sand beach sloped gently out. There was only a ripple of water. Hudson got down into the sea, and keeping within the protection of the water, started to explore the coast to the west, in the direction of the smoke. He found a house, setting at the water's edge. It was the very strangest house that one could imagine. Bennett could not get the details very clearly out of Hudson's wild talk. It seemed to be a type of the mission house in the East, except that it was screened all over with a close matting of every sort of fabric to be found in that part of the world. And there was a sort of screened way running from it right down into the sea. There was no opening on the island side. Doors that way had all been closed and sealed tight. The chimney pipe from which the smoke ascended had a closed wire screen over it. Hudson got a conception of these things as he approached through the water. Man had been driven out of this island. The invading insects had forced him out, crowded him out. Here at the water's edge was the last stand of the last people on it. He entered, wading into the covered way from the sea. Bennett had difficulty to piece out the story here. The speech of the unconscious man under the sail screen on his deck got rapid, ran into a swift jumble of expressions. But from the hard fragments and the froth of delirium, Bennett understood that Hudson found in that house the thing he was seeking, and that events happened quickly. Bennett said there was a missionary and his daughter in the house, and there was also an Oriental. He couldn't quite determine the status of the Oriental. He seemed to have been the king or head man of the island originally, and he seemed also to be at the time Hudson landed the source of the food supply of the three besieged persons. They were horribly besieged by the vast armies of insects that had overrun the island. Fish was the only food. The Oriental got it out of the sea. It was this thin smoke from the fish cooking over a fire of dried insects that had signaled Hudson. Bennett wasn't quite clear about the status or relation of the persons. That is, with respect to the Oriental. The missionary was dying. Did die, the night Hudson came in. The girl, it seemed, thought it was friendship for her father that kept the Oriental in their service. He could have got away. Bennett, who knew the Oriental mind better, thought the native hung on to get the girl when the old man finally died. The dying man himself had some fearful idea of that sort. He seemed to keep alive on that fear, for he snapped out the moment it was relaxed. He was a thin ghost of a man under a blanket, and he hailed Hudson as an answer to prayer, a messenger of rescue that God had sent him. There was only life enough in the creature to utter his blessing over the visitor when he came in. They buried him that night under the floor of the house. Hudson raved over the girl. Bennett couldn't get the dope, as he called it, on her clear. Hudson seemed to know her, seemed to have been mad about her for a long time. He jabbered of her as a dream woman, a wonder of God, a fairy creature out of some strange heaven. Bennett couldn't get it straightened out. She was a dark-haired, slender girl with masses of hair around a face of dreams, a sort of wonder creature imagined in the fancy of a drug, in sacred groves. Of course, I knew Hudson had found the one he was seeking. The instinct in him was sound. She was here besieged by the insects in this accursed place, and following the insistence of his dream, he had come finally to her. Across the waste of the world, it was the waste of the world to him. When one loves a woman, or the ideal, or the dream of a woman as he did, as all of us sometimes do, the whole world is a devastation without her. You must remember how awfully his reality of life had been wrecked. The whole physical aspect of reality had gone down with it. He had to find her, and he did find her. He had come to her here in this lost corner of Asia, come to her from the other side of the world with only the instinct and the dream to guide him. He had come to her precisely as the moth had come to the screened window in Provence, seeking its mate, carried away by the old naturalist out of the south of Europe. It was an equally inexplicable example of that profound mystery. I have no verbal theory about it. The old naturalist, sensibly, had none. He gave it up. There was some instinct, we may call it that, leading the moth to its mate, leading Hudson over 4,000 miles of sea to the girl he longed for. Some instinct, some sense-direction of the soul that the despair of a consuming emotion can, in its dire extremity, summon to its aid. God, to have looked on at that meeting. Think of the thing. When Hudson came wading through the sea into that house, and lifting up his face saw the girl standing before him. Here she was, a reality, and in the world. Her eyes wide, her dark hair a cloud about her face, her slender body as of a dryad out of a sacred grove. Remember that up to this very hour, for all the passion in him, she had been a mere fancy of the mind, a vision of the night watches. For all his longing, he could not be certain that she lived. He could hope, he could believe, he could have the faith of the apostles, but he could not be certain. The pen fingers fail when one tries to write down the sweep of heavenly joy that must have surged up in his soul. He had found her. The old pagan peoples groping in the dark, at the morning of the world, made that thrill of the soul the cult of a religion. A man would give his roof tree and his lands. He would give the days of his life. He would give a promised heaven of angel choruses for a day, for an hour, with a woman that he loved like this. Think of the thing. Think of the vast difference between the meeting in this house and that other meeting in Lord X's house in the environs of London. Remember, there was nothing with which to piece out the scene. One had to get it from conjecture. The fragments Hudson gave in his mad talk were only hints of it. They were the merest vague hints. Bennett wasn't certain at first that there had in fact been any such person on the island. But in the end, when he got the puzzle all pieced together, he saw there must have been. The dope on the situation was more definite. This had been one of the great fertile rice islands of the China Sea, a green paradise cultivated like a garden. No spot on the whole earth could have equaled it, as though the authority that had made the world had finished up there a bit of the job, precisely to suit him, just to see what he could turn out if he did his best on it. But it was the old story of human selfishness. The flocks of migrating birds stopped over on this island, and they took some toll of the rice fields. They also removed the insects from the fields. But the natives seemed not to consider that. It was the toll of the rice that they complained of. They took this complaint to their Oriental headman, and he worked out a plan to poison the birds. The missionary and his daughter protested. The old man pointed out what would happen. He knew what the insect life on the earth would do to it if the birds were removed. He was an American, it seemed, and he had the data from his own country. The insect life and man were in a terrific struggle for possession of the earth. The birds alone held the earth for the race. The prodigious procreation of insect life was simply incomprehensible. 5 billions of birds in the United States of America alone stood between the human population of that country and the devastation of death. If the birds were driven from the island, the insect life would destroy it. But it was no go. There was that fixed notion in the Oriental mind. Bennett understood it. This head man purchased a cargo of arsenic from a tramp trader and put it out. The migrating birds were poisoned by millions. And just here is where the girl stood out in Hudson's wild talk. She was on the side of the birds. She tried to frighten them out of the poisoned rice fields. She fed them clean rice on top of the mission house and in the bit of garden about it. The birds learned finally after the awful slaughter. They came only to the mission for the clean rice. She fed them as long as she could get the rice. They swarmed around her. She stood out a picture like that in Hudson's delirium. There was a point in the whole incredible adventure, the girl and the birds. They knew her, swarmed to her, seemed to pass the knowledge of her along. They abandoned the island, but long after the clean rice to feed them failed, they continued to circle over the mission house on their way north, continued still to do it. When the birds revolted, the insects did the rest. Hudson saw the result. The paradise became a loathsome hell. The native population was exterminated, driven into the sea. This house was the last stand. The missionary held the advance of the insects with poison sprays from the remainder of the arsenic cargo, but he was driven out, as all life, animal and vegetable, was driven out. Screened in a cage to be constantly wetted with poison, he was besieged at the water's edge. This was the situation when Hudson waded in around the point of land from the deck of the sampan. He arrived on the stroke of time. The besieged persons were in the last extremity. There was no further material for screens. The store of arsenic was used up. There was no food but fish. The old missionary was dying. And the thing he found was no mere vague dread. The Oriental knew what he was about. One incident convinced Hudson, if any man with a knowledge of the East needed a proof. There was an old service pistol with some cartridges hanging on the wall by the girl's bed in her father's room. When Hudson examined it, he found it useless. The firing pin had been filed off. That pistol just there gave Hudson a clue, he thought, to the girl's state of mind. But she kept it from the dying man. She consoled him with a strange fancy. The birds would take care of her if anything happened to him. They would take her to the land they migrated to. Some fairy country. It was a brave piece of business, but she got the dying man in half belief of it. His deep religious convictions, no doubt, gave the fancy a sort of substance. It fitted into the inscrutable compensations of God. Some way was always found to rescue the righteous. God sometimes sent the birds. The ravens had fed Elijah in the wilderness. The girl drew on the sacred text. It would be all right. He need have no fear about it. And she adorned the idea and elaborated it for the dying man, to the extent even of conjectures on the land to which the birds would take her, some vague earthly paradise, the destination of the birds in their mysterious migration. It was brave business, with that old service pistol the actual reality, the only escape for her. One had to realize that the old man was hanging to life by a mere cobweb. He did not understand anything beyond the elemental fact that a white man had arrived, and that they were now all right. He could go. It must have been like one of those dramatic scenes in the Old Testament scriptures. The messenger of God, long prayed for, had appeared. All peril, all anxiety for his daughter was ended. The cobweb thread of life parted, and the blessing the feeble man poured out. Like that, the old man passed. He did not know how little Hudson could help, how the white man must have damned that mutinous Chinese crew, with his ship standing by. But there was no ship. There was only the bare sampan, hawsered to a point of rock, undulating in the sea, parted by a dozen strides of salt water from this loathsome island. Hudson and the girl faced the fact, with the Oriental grinning by the door. The native was disturbed, but he was not giving up. Bennett understood something of the workings of the native mind. A chink can wait when he sees a thing on its way to him. Otherwise, he doesn't wait. He can be as quick as the men of any race. It was of no use to wait now. But there was one thing the Oriental didn't realize. The white men he knew were physically innervated by the East. He didn't count on the iron body Hudson brought with him into Asia. The gain he got out of the coal fields when he was retrieving his fortune. The iron body that made such a ghastly wreck of Lord X that night in the drawing room. Things moved quickly. There was only one thing to do. They must trust themselves to the sea. Bennett stopped here in his narrative. He poured out another glass of brandy, poured the dirty glass full to the brim, but he did not at once drink it. He sat back in his chair with his big hands folded in front of him. Here had been a difficult place to piece together with Hudson's fragments. What happened wasn't precisely clear. One thing, however, was certain. There had been a very devil of a fight. It had started like a flash with some jitsu grip that the Oriental had tried on Hudson as he passed behind him. Bennett knew the sort of thing, had seen it on the south coast, seen men's spines snapped by it, a cruelly quick thing. But the native hadn't got his grip quite right. Hudson had a warning, or he changed his position at the moment, and the chink wasn't counting on an iron body against his jitsu. Anyway, the trick failed, and that devil's fight got underway. The native must have been a husky brute. The fight wrecked the house, wrecked all the netting, and went on outside. Bennett didn't know the details, but it ended in an old-fashioned English hip lock that brought the Oriental down with his own spine snapped. He couldn't move, and the insects got him. Bennett paused. One needed no comment on that awful, loathsome horror. Hudson and the girl had to run for it then. The insects swarmed in now that the poisoned nettings all around the house were gone. There was no time for anything. They had to go. They waded along the beach through the water to the sampan. It lay there hawsered to the point of rock, and Hudson got it off. Their only chance was on the sea. A damned poor chance, as Bennett said, but it was the only one. The crawling curse over that whole island extended to the water on every side. It overran the house now, and everything it contained. No living thing could remain, could live an hour outside the security of the sea. Stripped clean, it was a choice of deaths. That's how it looked to Bennett, how it must have looked to Hudson. But anything was better than what the chink got. A raw trunk, denuded of every feature, writhing in a massive vermin. One would die clean in the sea. But even that fortune seemed denied them. The current ran landward. That's how Hudson managed to come ashore. And in spite of every effort, the man could not get the sampan out into the open sea. He worked like a piece of plank for an oar, and the girl helped. But the current was against them. It always brought the craft back to the island. That doomed spot seemed to draw them like a magnet. They couldn't manage to come clear of it. The cruel, disheartening struggle went on between the trapped man and the sea. The two people toiling like the damned would get the craft out for a distance, and then the current would suck it in. There could be only one end. A sea current doesn't tire out. It seemed like a strange, vicious intent in nature against them. There was a bit of wind blowing toward the sea, enough to stimulate hope in the man, always to a further effort. But it was a little irony of the wicked gods. With any sort of sail, the sampan would have overcome the current, but there was nothing but the bare rigging for the wind to drift through. Then, when the end appeared, the miracle happened. A great swarm of white birds moving north settled on the rigging of the sampan, clustered, massed on it like a hive of bees. They were small downy things, and their close, cluttered, feathery bodies covered all the bare rigging as with a blanket of cotton wool. It made a sail. The resistance to the wind offered by this compact, feathery mass was enough to overcome the current. The sampan moved out into the open sea. Bennett stopped again in his narrative. The fingers of his big hands interlaced before him, moved as in a sort of tattoo. "I don't know," he said, and again, "I don't know." It was a profound comment going to the core of the thing. It was a migrating flock, I suppose, worn out with a long flight, and taking the first rest it could find, every bird crowding in to get a foothold. They would pack up like that if they were exhausted, but I don't know. He didn't mean a doubt on the essential fact. He meant a doubt on what one would call a rational explanation of it. He looked out the window at the slimy canal, and about him at the clubroom of the Wu-Fang Company carpeted with its dirty matting. He put out one of his hands, took up the glass of brandy, and drank it as one would a cup of water. "Maybe time don't count," he said. I caught at the word. It was the very point. And between the end of that sentence and the next, I had a flashed vision of the scene. They were together for a day on the sea, for a day convoyed by the birds. They were together on the rotten deck of the Chinese sampan. How long was that? Not the hemp of Asia only can extend the conception of time. Great emotion can extend it. I wrote it down a day, but was it not rather the days and nights of a life? Eons, light year, duration incredibly extended? This is the very point that Nordheim's story put its thumb on. It's the reason I gave you that derelict story in detail. The extension of time that the man experienced in the moment of his descent into the sea. The extension of time that the lost creature sought at the head of his river in the Malay Peninsula. They were evidence, persuasive evidence of the vast, incredible possibility. Time is no reality. It is no thing fixed in nature. It is a condition of the mind. Great emotions play the devil with it. Even the physical transmutations of a drug can put it out of balance. You see now why I repeated the stories of the two derelicts in the clubroom of the Wu-Fang Company. Suppose you had got the idea that Hudson's dream ended, like the dream of Chillingsworth's traitor ended. Death at the end of it. That would be the end in one view, if one saw only a single, narrow, culminating fact. But here was the human mind, drugged by a great emotion out of all conception of time. Seated on the deck of the sampan together, convoyed by the birds, the sea extending like an empty world about them, they lived on. Bennett summed the whole thing up in his next sentence. Maybe that day on the sea was enough for them. That was a further vital point. We can't stand much. I mean, the human body won't stand a long strain. It goes to pieces. They couldn't have lived on like that in any world we know. We have no word to describe what that man and that girl felt for one another. The rotten deck of that hot, dirty Chinese sampan was a paradise. They were together. That summed it up. Bennett fingered the dirty brandy glass. There came a sudden energy in his voice. Don't we slave through a whole hell of a life just to get a moment of what we want? Does anybody know how big that moment can be? Maybe it can fill all the time there is. He arose. It was a marvel to me that he could stand with all that vicious liquor in him. He picked up the Italian translation of The Passing of Arthur, that his companion had left lying by the chair when he went out, crossed the room, and carefully set it in the packing box shelf beside the old books on navigation. I don't know what happened, he said. The girl may have slipped from the deck of the sampan into the sea after the exhaustion of that terrible adventure. That white man may have rolled into the sea from the deck of my ship, or the two of them may have passed with the birds to some earthly paradise. Anyway, he was gone one morning, and the native lookout said he saw the cloud pass. End of Chapter 3. End of The Revolt of the Birds by Melville Davisson Post.